Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
This is Bronze.
And this is I Am.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the ever pertinent existential threat of the Southern Europe, debt.
Yeah, debt, and why a lot of the stuff you know about debt is a scheme of class warfare. Oh yeah, we're getting spicy.
Right off the bat, I see.
Yeah, we're going big this week, right? Because what you have to understand, there, listener, is that a lot of the stuff that you've heard in the discourse TM or on the news about debt is nonsense. God, is it nonsense? It's painful how stupid it is, right? But before we get into all the reasons why, I feel like we need to get into some history. Specifically, the economic history of the 20th century, in brief. And by brief, I mean criminally brief. Right? So we start off with the golden age of laissez-faire that starts off from 1870 odd to the First World War. And this period is characterized by the gold standard. And the gold standard is a system of pegging your currency to gold. And the purpose of this was that in this age of growing international commerce, you would have a way of verifying that foreign currency that you received was valid. Right? Because imagine that you are in the business of shipping Argentinian beef to the UK. That was a big business. And so you go to Argentina and you want to buy the beef, but how do the Argentinians know that your beautiful pounds sterling are worth anything? It's because you can trade them in at any bank for gold. And everyone has sort of agreed that gold is useful, or at least valuable. Right? So that's and also, it was the theory that gold acts as to limit inflation. And but there are many problems with gold. And the biggest problem with gold is that it fundamentally limits the rate at which the economy can grow to the speed at which you can mine gold, which is a ridiculous thing to limit the growth of human endeavor to, at what rate we can extract a mineral from the ground.
So what Bronze is trying to say here, this listener, is that by demographics alone, not even speculation here, the gold standard would be rendered completely inoperable.
Yeah, because we keep making more and more stuff, but the amount of gold, there's amount of gold in the world doesn't increase that fast. You know, there's only there's pretty much a top speed at which you can mine gold. It's not very big. It's not very fast. But the gold standard sort of collapses in the First World War. Because essentially, the theory was that in times of war or great distress, you would abandon the gold standard and thereby ensure liquidity that you could use to buy guns and whatnot. And then, through fiscal austerity, you could get yourself back on the gold standard. And so this is what was attempted in a lot of the world. And it was a disaster. The bigger, right? The austerity of the post-World War I years was terrible. Because the problem is, and this is going to sound very counterintuitive, but cutting spending doesn't reduce debt adequately. Because it's fundamentally it's a denominator problem. And so if you consider, how we measure the debt of countries is to debt to GDP. And in the modern world, government spending is invariably a major factor in GDP, obviously, right? Because governments are big, and they spend money, and that contributes to the economy. So if you cut spending, the GDP, falls. And if GDP falls, then that means the debt to GDP rises. And so doesn't really make much sense to cut yourself out of a crisis. Because in the worst case scenario, you've entered a deflationary death spiral, and essentially you have to keep sort of trying to cut the budget until there's nothing left, and so there's no growth, and then you're sort of fucked. Pardon the language. And so the worst cases of the pains of trying to get back on gold were incurred in Japan and France. In Japan, the government trying to cut its spending to get out of its massive debt that it took on to get back on the gold standard, forced it to cut military spending. And this was very unpopular with the military. And so their solution was kill members of the Japanese cabinet until they do what we want.
Seems like a very good policy to have a stable government.
Yeah, government assassination seems fine.
Yeah, and so essentially the Japanese got themselves out of it because the military came in, established their regime, which was very, they spent a lot of money, and it was generally that went poorly. There's a lot of instability. The 30s in Japan were not a good time, but in France, right, the Bank of France was a very strange institution because it was built in such a way that its board was made up of representatives from the 200 wealthiest families in France. Right? And they had their sort of modus operandi was to defend the franc at all costs. And so they embarked on a sort of horrific regime of austerity to get France back on gold. And if you're wondering why did all these nations in the 20s and 30s go through such great pains to get back on gold, because that was sort of thought as the right thing to do, I guess, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
On the topic of 20s, I think we should also briefly touch on the myth, well, not precise myth, but how German hyperinflation during the 20s was self-inflicted rather than a consequence of the Great Crash.
Because So, and one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot in this episode is how Milton Friedman is essentially set back economics like a century and a half. Because he started, he is responsible for the idea that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And all I will say about that proposition today is that it's wrong. It's completely wrong. If you want me to spend 4 hours discussing every single which way that it's wrong, send us an email. But needless to say, inflation is a very sort of complicated process that can have a lot of various different causes and a lot of various different effects. But Milton Friedman, out of a political agenda to promote a very deflationary monetary politics, created the idea that inflation was created and is always created by monetary policy.
To simplify things,
it's actually the meme of printing money causes inflation.
Yes.
Yeah. In the mind, there has been inextricably linked the proposition of increased money supply with inflation. And that's not to say that if printing money carelessly can't cause inflation, or that the size of the money supply and inflation are not linked. But essentially, inflation occurs because the government chooses for it to occur. Right? That doesn't mean they want inflation. That just means they have not made the limiting of inflation one of their key priorities. And one of the most famous cases of inflation that is a great example to illustrate this is the German hyperinflation. I'm sure many of you listeners have seen on the internet and elsewhere pictures of German families carrying around wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. And those are very real images. But they were not created by the German government recklessly printing money. But the inflation was a deliberate strategy to shaft the French on war reparations. Because if you inflate, if you destroy the value of the Reichsmark, then having to pay back the French, how many millions of Reichsmarks it was, I can't remember, but right, it became a trifle of a sum because they had caused inflation. But in reality, what characterized Weimar Germany economically was actually severe deflation caused by a ruthless austerity policy to try to get the Germans back on gold. And this policy was pursued both by the German right, that is not, by which I don't mean the National Socialists, but the established German right, the liberals and the conservatives, and also by the German left, the SPD. Because what you have to understand is that they espoused the teachings of a certain Karl Marx. And Karl Marx had taken a lot of his macroeconomic theory from Ricardo. And so the so-called theologians of the SPD had really taken the Ricardian spirit to heart and were very much, Ricardians when it came to monetary policy.
It's kind of a bizarre. It's a kind of bizarre historical note if you think about it. That sort of like as a sort of series of events that I mean, I don't doubt it because I mean there was also the whole idea of there was this like I think it was something like it was like it was some proposal for a guilder or something, which the SPD floated at one point, where they essentially wanted to have a currency that always deflated in value, which is like quite a bizarre thing to think about.
Yeah, but I mean, the SPD wasn't certainly not unique in this. There are a lot of socialist parties, arguably even to this day, are quite Ricardian in their understanding of monetary economics.
Bizarre, since you would think that they would want there to be more money to individual people rather than the people who have money to get progressively even more money by doing nothing with it.
Yeah, which I mean, Marx sort of, because of his very much the Ricardian influence, sort of viewed as the only possible option, if that makes sense.
So what then do you think in terms of this idea of inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? That sort of and this kind of I know, especially in 2000 when there was the potential crash that was avoided. That was avoided by shifts in monetary policy, and is this in large part because of Milton Friedman's understanding understanding of monetary policy, that it's like this, the central bank is the sort of key institution almost.
So I would say that it comes from a few various sources that coagulated in the 1980s, specifically under Friedman. And so to talk about why those exist, we have to talk about the thing that comes directly after the war, which comes from all this austerity, and that's Keynesianism. Because what Keynes realized is that all this sort of cutting ourselves to prosperity and the trying to mercilessly get back on gold is pretty ridiculous, right? And so his economic policy started winning out post-war, especially in England, but also in a lot of other countries, right? And they kept a sort of austerity ideology and the sort of idea that, because Keynes was very much aware. I would say that he makes the mistake of going too far the other way, of making the inflation too much a matter of the fiscal, when I think it's much more both. But during the long winter of Keynesianism, there was sort of two sort of redoubts of, because the thing is that in macroeconomics, there's viewed as this compromise between inflation and unemployment. That you can either have high inflation and low unemployment, or high unemployment and low inflation. And Keynes was certainly a man of the former, right? Because if you have very strong unions and a state that intervenes on behalf of wage earners, and this is where you get Koletsky's labor theory of inflation, that since workers do the spending, any increases in pay negotiated for by unions have to come from the increasing of prices by capital. That is to say, if you have a shoe factory, if the workers in the shoe factory have an increase of wages, the money supplied thereby must be produced by an increase in the price of shoes, and so the real wage of the worker has not increased. That is, there is a supply pull, that is a demand pull on the cost of shoes, and therefore it goes up. And that this continues in a spiral that is known as stagflation, which was the crisis of Keynesianism in the 70s. Right? And the fear of stagflation became sort of the crisis of neoliberalism. It was its principal fear. It was, the stagflation of the late 70s was the Reichstag fire of neoliberalism, is the claim I'm going to make today. Right? And so during the Keynesian period, from about, the end of the war to 1979, there were two main camps of anti-Keynesian thinking, the Germans and the Austrians. So the Germans came up with a system known as Ordoliberalism, which had started already in the late 19th century, and then it had a small flourishing in the interwar period, and then it managed to stay relatively sort of undercover, not undercover as in hiding, but sort of under the radar during the Nazis, and emerged to be a dominant faction in German economic academia after the fall of the Nazis. And
To this day, mind you, ordoliberalism is still essentially
it is the de facto ideology of the Germans.
Yep.
When it comes to their relationship with Europe and their policies at home. And so what ordoliberalism was the management of an economy by what is called an Ordnung. And so this was a form of economic liberalism which avoided the classical problem of the liberal state. And this is something that goes all the way back to Smith and Hume in the 18th century. No, it goes back to Locke, actually. That liberalism has a problem with the state because it can't live with it, it can't live without it, and it certainly does not want to pay for it. But the Ordoliberals got around this by baking the idea of the state into their version of liberal economics. So the idea was that the state does not interfere in economics like a Keynesian state would say, asset restrictions or the manipulation of wages or bailing out failing businesses. But it does create a very strict Ordnung, that is to say, an economic order that creates prosperity. And it was, and this sort of order was based around productivity, low imports, high rates of saving, and minimizing imports. It was almost a little bit mercantilist in that way. And this sort of, and it sort of goes back to this German mindset of, I don't know, but like first save, then shop. Sparen, then kaufen, I think. And so the idea was that they would all export and be productive. And this way they could have liberal economics and not face the sort of dilemma of the state. And the other faction was the Austrians, by which I don't mean the nation, but the school of economics that had come to flourish in America under, say, the likes of Schumpeter. Because he was an Austrian that had gone to America and become very influential. And they sort of set themselves up, especially at the University of Chicago, and started developing the sort of their critical idea. But they did not have the sort of... They still did have the problem of the state, but they were much more radical austerity politicians than the Ordnung's liberals.
So much so, they wildly supported, influenced, and determined Pinochet's economic policy. The part where he starved his own people.
Yeah. So anyway, in the end of the 1970s, there is the crisis of Keynesianism, the stagflation. And all this coagulates under Milton Friedman and the monetarists, represented by Friedman in America and a man called Patrick Minford in the UK. Right? And so one of the things Friedman comes up with is the concept of the natural rate of unemployment as a consequence of the theory of voluntary unemployment.
In short, he believed unemployment and consequently poverty were a choice.
He did not believe they were a choice as well. He did believe they were a choice, right? But essentially, it wasn't that the worker simply had no opportunity for labor, but that due to market conditions, wages had fallen to such a low that the worker was not willing to work. Right? That sort of the unemployed man had done a cost value benefit analysis and decided that the low wages currently given by market conditions are no longer worth his effort. Right? And so following from this idea, he stipulated that there was a natural rate of unemployment. Right? In an economy, there will always be people who are unemployed. And so trying to push unemployment below this figure, would disproportionately increase inflation and destabilize the economy. And so the monetarists, adopted the policy of crushing inflation at all costs. And this was sort of the foundational principle of neoliberalism was, whatever it takes to destroy inflation. Right, and so he revitalized all these defunct ideals of, austerity and debt And
he revived the crunch towards the gold standard there were in the interwar years. Except now we don't even have the gold.
yeah, I mean, the gold, we don't really need the gold because we have the dollar, which is like gold, except more useful.
For those who don't understand what he's meaning, he's referring to the fact that all of the world's currencies are directly or indirectly pegged to the dollar or dollar products such as petrodollar, etc. So in a way, we already have a single global currency.
Yeah, and it's the dollar, but it's pretty strange because, as one of the sort of foundational tenets of Keynesianism was fixed conversion between currencies, and that was out of the window. And so now it's sort of weird because it's all the dollar, but they fluctuate against each other, and so that's another dynamic.
In short, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's all the same currency. It's just think of it as governments competing against one another in another new field of war that isn't a battlefield.
Yeah.
So it isn't supposed to fluctuate, but it does due to policy.
Well, it fluctuates due to a lot of things, some of which are policy. But anyway.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and so, but obviously, right, the what you might notice is that the destruction of inflation comes to benefit a very particular class. Because if we go back to Keynes and Kalecki and the labor theory of inflation, right? If wages do not rise because there is no inflation, there is no bargaining in the economy, right? But the assets of the wealthy are not subject to inflation, there comes to be a very unequal distribution of society. And as the inflation falls due to the direct monetary policies associated with it, the limiting of it, we see that labor's share of national income keeps falling, and that there in real terms has not been a rise in wages since 1979.
The famous, well, not famous for you two, but the famous statement: Europe hasn't grown since the 30 glorious years.
Oh, I mean, I'm familiar.
Well, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, the 30 glorious years being the period of Keynesianism. And so then all this is compromised because there comes then, as there was for Keynesianism, a crisis of neoliberalism.
Which we are currently living.
Yeah, and which we have lived for the last 12 years, because the crisis of neoliberalism was the 2008 recession. But something very interesting happened in 2008. And that is that we did not fail the system. We bailed the system. So essentially, the bailouts that were conducted at the end of the 2008 recession, essentially, we sort of Frankenstein reanimated the dead corpse of neoliberalism.
So what you're saying is that the system that kicked Keynesianism into a pit had to be Keynesian back into living.
Well, it was not Keynesian back to living, because I think there is sort of this association that the state doing something is Keynes, but in fact I think the 2008 bailouts were sort of distinctly anti-Keynes. I think they were done in such a way that if presented to both a Keynesian and an Austrian, both would be very much displeased.
Yeah, true. Keynes was pro low unemployment and like vaguely defined pro worker, not pro big corporate or big bank, I suppose. At least the application of his policies weren't.
I
Yeah.
mean, the bigger issue is that the Austrian would say no bailouts. Like
Yeah,
there's
because
there's schools of Austrians who even sort of think that there's no such thing as like a market crash because it's just the market adjusting itself. So like there are people who literally think it's just the will of the market. You
the
shouldn't do
Austrian would
anything.
say that that is an
Yeah.
undue interference. And the Keynesian would say that it's not a solution at all because you've done nothing about the fiscal. What you've essentially done is you've taken the bad assets of the banks and you've put them on the taxpayer's bill. That's what essentially what was, And then, and this is why we started this episode by saying that it's going to be about debt. Now, this was just the preamble. Essentially, right, and after this, you see on the news, you've probably seen, the website counters and such, that, oh my God, there is a debt crisis. How are we going to deal with all this debt? Jesus, it's terrible. And then this sort of weaselly idea that, oh, the only way we have to get out of this debt is by cutting spending. But in fact, there is no such thing as the debt crisis. Right? What there is a banking crisis. Right? If you've seen, Senator Paul Ryan on the news talking about how there's been an orgy of public spending and now we have to cut back. It's plainly ridiculous because where's the spend? There has been no public spending. There was never an orgy of public spending that ballooned us into the debt. The debt came from the bad assets of the banks. Right, and then the sort of and then people are sort of.
And in case someone is doubting what we're stating, if you go look up the European countries, which is the only example I'm familiar with, that didn't bail out their banks, that let them fail, namely Iceland. Yes, Iceland, Denmark, I think, and other such cases, they're now doing fine. Meanwhile, Portugal, Spain, Italy to a lesser degree, but also, and Greece, who bailed out all of their banks, well, guess fucking what? We're not good, not by a long shot. No
Right,
matter.
because the Icelandics did what the Keynesian would do, which is let the banks fail and then have the state pick up the pieces. That's the Keynesian response. The Austrian might have sort of just let the pieces fall onto the floor, but that's I don't have that much respect for the Austrians. I don't have that much respect for the Keynesians either, but I have certainly much more respect for them. Right, really what the bailouts were they were monetarist, they were neoliberal, they were Friedmanite. The idea that we must bail out the banks to prevent inflation, so that the assets of the rich will not be harmed. Right, and so we have all this debt created by the crash, which what argument you want to make or not about how should we not have bailed out the banks, or I would say we should have done it a lot differently. But setting that big question aside, right, the response, which has been to cut, has been an abysmal failure. Because as I said, you can't cut your way to growth. Or at least everyone can't cut their way to growth all at once. Because then you incur a fallacy of composition. right? Which is, if we're all cutting, there's nowhere for it to go. And so what we're doing is we're just sort of shrinking the economy, and has the debt decreased from the cutting of spending? Obviously not. No. The way you get out of debt is by growing the economy. Right? But growing the economy in such a way that may incur inflation would be disastrous to the assets of the rich. Disastrous in quite a mild sense. Certainly much less disastrous than pitchforked gangs eating them. But that's whatever. There's just... Right, and now we're in a different crisis altogether. Right, because there's just... I don't even know. Right, because what's going to happen again is that people are going to say, oh, we have spent too much and we need to cut back. And that's only going to make it worse. And, there's the counterexamples of the sort of, the Latvian miracle. That, the Latvians cut their way to growth, they cut all their spending, and they got rid of all their debt. Which, for one, is sort of completely non-transportable, because Latvians, great nation though I'm sure they are quite unique in their economic circumstances. And two, the Latvian miracle didn't really work as a success. Well, they got rid of their debt, but really what they ended up with was sort of, they crippled their long-term growth to do it.
They're no longer even a sovereign nation, economically speaking, because they sold everything that wasn't bolted to the ground. Latvia no longer exists.
Well, they're not so much sold it as they had it repossessed.
I would wager against the Baltic Sea at this point.
Yeah, because if you sell something, you at least get something in return. Which... one can't really say they have.
So in short, they broke their own back to clear out a rather pointless statistic.
Right.
God, that sounds so European Union, it almost hurts.
Yeah, but I want to stress that I do not want to blame the Latvians for their sorrows, for they did so very much under the threat of German economic violence.
Also known as an everyday reality of being a member of the EU.
Yeah, because the EU is very much transformed into Germany's fiscal dungeon, right? And that's direct sort of cause of ordoliberalism.
If you allow me to explain this in a very concise way. So you remember when Bronze said that ordoliberalism was mercantilist, right? So here's the issue with mercantilism: if everyone protects their imports, no one is exporting. So Germany essentially uses the European Union as its guaranteed export market by protecting imports of other European countries into it, but making sure that every other European country must import from Germany. So essentially, the European Union can be seen as an economic appendage to Germany rather than anything else.
Right, because essentially it's sort of an economic why are you punching yourself? Right, because essentially they use the deficits that they created of the pigs, that is to say, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, and Italy. Not in that order, because then it doesn't spell out the word pigs. That was the order I can remember them. it uses their deficits to facilitate their own surplus, and then turns around to those nations and says, why do you have so big deficits? Right, because ordoliberalism sort of states that we're all supposed to run surpluses. But that's a compositional fallacy. Everyone can't run a surplus, because for every surplus there has to be a deficit.
You can run a surplus if you run it against the moon.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Right, but so essentially, and the Germans, the why they have done this in such a torturous way, I'd argue, is due to the German morality of debt, best illustrated by linguistics. The German word for debt is Schuld, meaning guilt. Right? Essentially, according to the sort of this ordoliberal system, if you are indebted, then you are sort of morally lesser, right? That over borrowing, so to say, Greece has done, is wrong and reckless, which is incredibly hypocritical if you consider that there cannot be over borrowing without over lending, which is exactly what the Germans are doing. The deficit is directly created by German policy to facilitate its own surpluses.
In short, it's bleeding the South dry.
Yeah, because essentially, the whole of Europe have tied themselves to the apparatus of the European Central Bank, which exists as Germany's fiscal dungeon to promote their ordoliberal system. And so it has said, oh, you've all been so naughty and borrowing, so we're going to run a very deflationary economic policy for all of Europe. Because we have to cut back on spending, because we've been guilty. Well, not we, you've been guilty. And so, oh no, is there no growth in Southern Europe? It's almost like there wasn't any spending because we've purposely created a deficit to run our surplus against. That's weird. So weird.
But then an Italian took over the European Central Bank and lended money like wild, so the South could have its deficits but not starve. The situation is the same. We're just not up in arms and voting for potentially dangerous left or right wing parties that might upset German dominance. Is really the point here.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, essentially, it's sort of like it's like a bootstrap thing. Because the Germans, they had their version of the Trente Glorieuses, which was the Wirtschaftswunder, which was sort of the sort of hard ordoliberalism under the CDU.
Yes,
Which was
CDU.
CDU, yeah. Right, it's essentially saying, oh, we came out sort of completely battered by the war, and then we worked hard, exported, had surpluses. Why can't you do that? Not really realizing that that set of policies was sort of completely contingent on a set of material realities that don't exist anymore, partially due to German ordoliberalism.
In short, the European Union is a time bomb, fiscally and economically.
Yeah, it's just like it's just a dungeon, right? It's this sort of dungeon of austerity that sort of kills all growth in the name of big surplus.
Which directly benefits the Germans more than anyone else.
Yeah, because they have surpluses.
Also, I would like to also point out, since this episode did kind of turn into a bit of a German unmasking, and this is and what I'm going to say makes more sense for Europeans per se, though still in the European Union. Remember that when people are talking about making the European Union, especially the European Parliament, more democratic, about voting, etc., 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 I would like to remind you all of the simple factor of demographics, and that by almost an order of magnitude, Germany is the most populous country in the European Union. Anything that brings the votes of the individual to count more means that Germany will have inevitably more power in the parliament. Because what people forget in all of these proposals is that if the European Parliament becomes more democratic, they're thinking of dropping the restrictions. Yeah, you can't have a majority or a parliamentary group or what have you that doesn't have representatives of 7 different countries into just the majority of the people votes, which under certain circumstances could mean that the Germans would have absolute power over the EU. So uh, something to chew on in regards to structures of the European Union and how and their coding and what they truly do when applied. I know that was a completely unnecessary side chick, but I didn't need to mention it.
I'd also like to mention we've been focusing a lot on Europe because we live in Europe, but this is by no means unique to Europe in the way that these dynamics exist.
I believe a similar thing has been done internal to New York State, where New York State has kind of has been gutted by New York City. So I think, yeah, Albany, New York has declined it by like a third in population or something since 2008 because the city of New York has sort of swallowed everything by way of like specific monetary policy, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think that like the discourse around monetary policy in America makes very little because Americans are very obsessed with their own national debt and sort of have the cult of the dollar in the sense that, during the recent set of events, there was a set of quantitative easing in which the US Congress created another $2 trillion added to the market, and the Federal Reserve created another $4 trillion of liquidity. This being known as the great money printer go burr of 2020. And it caused sort of pandemonium on the internet over sort of fears of hyperinflation and that burgers would cost $1 billion by 2021. But what I think is incredibly revealing is that during all that reckless printing, which I'd argue was actually quite a meager amount of printing compared to what was feasible, the dollar deflated. That's right. During the quote-unquote printing of $6 trillion additional dollars, the dollar deflated. And the Friedmanite would say, well, that is impossible. Surely that cannot be, as the printing of money causes inflation. But it cannot be because the dollar, in a fundamental sense, is uninflatable because it is the fuel for the American deficit engine. Right? America, in the macroeconomic sense, is the sort of the deficit engine of which runs the world, and it is fueled by the hegemony of the dollar.
To simplify things, because everyone is buying dollars due to buying American debt, it is impossible to inflate the dollar because there's always more people who want to buy more debt. So even if there are quote unquote more dollars, it's irrelevant because they immediately get purchased, as it were.
Yeah, so if like Trump going all mercantilist over the American deficit, saying because I'm sure you have, and if you have not, you can easily find them on YouTube. His many speeches talking about his various America's various deficits to Mexico and China, and this being the cause of certain trade wars. Right, it's really a fuss over nothing because the deficit is not a problem for America, right? Because Trump's speeches sort of seem to imply that the deficit is dollars leaving, like its value going from America and to abroad. But in fact, it is just dollars going abroad in return for stuff, for materials and services bought by the Americans, right? And that level of deficit is fine because of the dollar, right? And that's where the sort of there is this thing, and I don't want to go completely off track because this episode will then last forever. But there's the concept of modern monetary theory, which states that why don't we just print money to pay off all the stuff, right? Which has sort of been exemplified by the former current leader of the American Greens, Jill Stein, when she said, well, if we could create 4 trillion for the 2008 recession, why can't we create 1.3 trillion to pay off all the student loans? And the more you think about it, the more it seems less and less ridiculous, because it sounds ridiculous. I mean, you can't just print money to pay off all the problems, right? But really, the sort of idea of fake stewardship that we can't be reckless and we have to be careful with the money comes from a deliberate ideology around not creating inflation, because inflation is what destroys the assets of the rich, right? That is to say that essentially my point is Milton Friedman is a cringe human who has set back economics 150 years, and his deflationary monetary policy is an act of class warfare. And if that doesn't instantly make sense, then write us an email, and we can do more episodes about this if people find this interesting. Right? If there's something in this episode that didn't make sense because we went over a lot of stuff quite quickly, then I think just send us an email, and we'll respond, or we'll make follow-up episodes.
Either via Discord, for those of you that are on the Discord, via email, or via YouTube comment, because we do read them, the two of them that we constantly have.
Yeah.
And
reach out to us on any of those, and we'll respond to the best of our ability, because some of the stuff can be quite tricky to explain, and we went over it quite quickly. And I understand that a lot of it doesn't make sense. Like, how can cutting spending increase debt, and how come printing money isn't that big of a deal, as I learned from Economics Explained videos on YouTube and Milton Friedman. And why is my life in a fiscal dungeon created by German surpluses? It's all weird, and I understand that it's weird. And so if any of this has not made sense, then please write to us on the email, the Discord, or the YouTube comments, and we'll try our best to clear it up.
Indeed, that's why we are here.
Yeah.
Seems like a good place to leave it. I don't really have too much else to say. I think that's a very good explanation overall. So yeah.
Yeah.
This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I was one of your hosts, McCosk.
I've been Bronze.
And I've been I Am.
Good night.